All right, Mark Rogers, TV, the voice of college football, all over media days this week with the SEC, the Big 12, and the ACC actually kicking off today. But of course, the SEC, the king of the hill when it comes to football talk. And Tennessee took the podium with Jeremy Pruitt in his first go at SEC Media Days, this time in Atlanta. We bring in Charlie Burris from Orange and White Report to talk up the Vols. Charlie, how you doing tonight?
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me. I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Absolutely. We always enjoy the discussion. It always turns into something interesting. And sometimes we have to turn the mundane into something interesting, but not necessarily this time around, with Aaron Murray leading the charge against Jeremy Pruitt for whatever reason when they didn't necessarily cross paths on the field or in the program. Just to give a little background for those who don't know, Jeremy Pruitt, defensive coordinator at Georgia, 1 year removed from Aaron Murray completing his stay at Georgia as the quarterback for 4 years. So Aaron Murray basically doesn't think that Jeremy Pruitt's up to that kind of job, apparently, as head coach.
The whole thing was odd. It was Aaron Murray and it was David Pollack both making comments. And the reason it was odd is because why now? Why weren't you saying this stuff when Jeremy Pruitt was hired? Because it was true, quote unquote, true. They say that they have all these stories of these things, these egregious things that Jeremy Pruitt did while he was at Georgia. But obviously, they're not going to say exactly what they are publicly. And so they just have to make these vague statements where I know he treated Mark Richt not very well, and you just have to take my word for it. And I'm not sure if he's set to be a coach. I don't want to say it was necessarily inappropriate, but I think on their part, it was just dumb because I think out of decorum, they can't explain the details there. And they shouldn't. I think it's personal stuff that happened between Mark Richt, Jeremy Pruitt. I know it became public in some sense that there was a rift there a little bit. But out of necessity, they can't discuss the details there. And so it just comes off as them trying to get personal attacks in at Jeremy Pruitt. And I thought it just really, it didn't add anything to the conversation, and it made everyone, on social media and everywhere, just it got everybody up in arms almost for no reason, because at the end of the day, when you look at that, it doesn't matter if Jeremy Pruitt wins. If he comes in and wins, great. If he comes in and he sabotages himself, whatever, the man hasn't coached a game yet. We don't know anything about what he's going to do. And so these criticisms off the top based on things that allegedly he did at Georgia, it just seemed really weird. And specifically from Aaron Murray, it felt very personal. It felt like there was a grudge. It felt like he was taking shots just to take shots rather than actually adding something to the conversation about Jeremy Pruitt. I just thought it was odd, but it gave us something to talk about, which was fun. I mean, we had a whole hour of show today on our radio show this morning. So, thanks to Aaron Murray for that, I guess. But, all in all, I think Pruitt's response to it was good. He said, I used to be a kindergarten teacher and now I'm the head coach of Tennessee's football program. And I don't think if you treat people wrong, that's going to happen for you. And I think he's right. I think it's a good response. It's short, to the point. He didn't try to explain himself or, go over the top trying to go into any kind of details. He just said, if I'm not treating people right, why do people keep giving me these jobs? So I think it's a non-factor in the long run. But, yeah, it was an interesting topic to talk about.
So on one hand, these people are human, so therefore they're going to be affected by personal attack to some degree. But at the same time, you would think anyone who's going to take a position as a head football coach in the SEC should have pretty thick skin, especially when the criticisms are so far removed from what they've done recently. So we're talking 4 or 5 years ago. We're also talking, as you mentioned, the timing doesn't make sense unless they feel as though they're going to gain more attention now. I don't really get it. Obviously, if any one particular person or commentator in this instance, this being Aaron Murray, former quarterback at Georgia, has these has this ill will and has these criticisms of Jeremy Pruitt. They haven't changed in 6 or 8 months, whatever it's been, and he got the job. And that's when the decision is made that this man is going to be the head coach at an SEC program. Therefore, this is when you typically analyze that decision. And then after that, he coaches spring practice and he recruits and he signs a class. He does all these things. And therefore, unless something is going to lead you to say, hey, this is confirmation of what I told you after he was hired. Otherwise, hey, he's off and running. He's a head coach. He's going to be completely judged as a head coach at Tennessee, more so than what his track record was as an assistant. And that's just the way it is. It doesn't mean that you should conduct yourself any better as a head coach than you do as an assistant. But the record is going to show what is Jeremy Pruitt going to do at Tennessee versus what he did as a coordinator. It's just the elevation in position, and you're leading a program.
Yeah, and I liked the take on, I forget exactly who said it. I watched so much analysis today that it slipped by me, but someone I saw said they knew of the rift or whatever happened at Georgia, and the overwhelming story was that it got complacent at Georgia, and Jeremy Pruitt was trying to kind of wake Mark Richt up and say, hey, how about we get this thing moving in a more aggressive winning way? And him and Rick kind of butted heads over it. But I forget who said it, but they said when they heard about that, it really came off to them like that is actually a trait of a head coach. That's not really the trait of just someone who's a combative assistant coach. It's someone who needs to be the boss and needs to be calling the shots. It's really an attitude that's good for a head coach, rather than the way that Aaron Murray is spinning it of like, oh, I don't know, he may not be fit the way that he treats other people. I think you could, turn it right back around and say, if he was just trying to push Mark Richt, and maybe he was overly aggressive or whatever he did, but if he was just trying to push Mark Richt to be, a better coach, have a better team, that sounds like a head coach to me. And so I think you could take it plenty of different ways. And you saw, I was surprised. Probably the most interesting thing from the day for me was Paul Feinbaum, who so often people forget as a Tennessee grad. And in some sense, he says that he's proud of going to Tennessee. You wouldn't know it if you watch his show every day, but he said, he ripped Aaron Murray. He said, what you have to say is not relevant to Jeremy Pruitt. And just had he called Butch Jones a pathetic carny barker, which was fun. But just basically said everything that I've been saying here, and that was interesting. And I think that really turned the conversation on its head, because it had arguably the biggest voice of the SEC network saying, Aaron Murray, just what are you doing? Shut up with this stuff. This is irrelevant. So interesting topic, but ultimately going to be a non-factor as long as Jeremy Pruitt wins. Who cares, man?
Charlie, the corporate buzzword would be coaching up, meaning, do you have the ability? Do you have the guts? Do you have the wherewithal to approach somebody at a higher position and call them out face to face and do it in a very straightforward way to let them know, hey, you are not pulling your weight. You are not leading in the right direction. You are whatever the situation is. And in this case, complacency is set in, according to Jeremy Pruitt, apparently. And that typically is one of many of what should be the attribute of somebody who's ready for the next level, the next job. And for Jeremy Pruitt, he received it at Tennessee. And he is coaching what has historically been one of the top 10 to 15 programs in America. So let's get to what else was stated. Did anything else stand out to you? This gained so much attention and obviously is not going to impact the football season one bit. And then we had all this other stuff talked about that didn't gain nearly as much attention. And we know that we only get excited for this. I think, Charlie, I'll speak for you for just a second, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong, because we can finally talk about and look forward to the upcoming season with some kind of substance, very little, but at least guys talking about the upcoming season, some fresh talk for us to talk about and respond to for the first time in forever.
Yeah, it was obviously it was great to just have actual football talk about the upcoming season. The things that stood out to me in what Jeremy Pruitt said wasn't a lot, and I think that's a good thing, because at this juncture with how wild this offseason was, and I mean I came on your show and talked about all the Greg Schiano stuff. I think most people know that whole deal. I mean, the offseason was the most insane thing that I've ever dealt with as a media member and probably will ever deal with. And I think Jeremy Pruitt would be very smart to just lay as low as possible. And I think in a lot of ways he did that outside of this, former Georgia players attacking him for some reason, that was completely out of his control. And I think he came out, seemed composed, but slightly uncomfortable, which in a way I actually like, because the entire vibe that I get off of Jeremy Pruitt every time he's in front of media is that he's doing it and he's fine with it, but he'd rather be coaching football. And, as far as that goes, I'm more than happy with that mentality, because Tennessee needs a football coach right now. They didn't have one in Butch Jones. They had a dude that would come out and say a bunch of slogans and, be a marketer, but ultimately he was just a used car salesman, And so I thought it was good. I mean, he had some tidbits in there where he talked some about his running back situation, where he said he wants to have 4 to 6 guys in the running back rotation, and he wants to get every single one playing time. There was things like that were interesting. During the entirety of spring practice, he never brought up individual players almost at all. He would dance around it in pretty impressive ways, actually, whenever he was asked, hey, what about Jarrett Garantano, your quarterback? Or something like that, and he would say, well, I don't want to speak on an individual player because we just don't know enough about them right now. And he actually did. He talked some about actual individual players, obviously the guys that he brought with him, who were Kyle Phillips, Eli Wolf, Marquez Callaway. Talked about them, but then also was asked about Brandon Kennedy, the transfer from Alabama, and said we're happy to have him. And someone asked him if that created a rift between him and Nick Saban, and he said absolutely not. It's just it's just business. So there were some interesting points, but ultimately there wasn't some kind of gaffe. There wasn't a champions of life comment, and like you would get with Butch Jones. And I'll say, thank God. That's exactly what I think. If you're Tennessee's PR team right now, you're coming away from this saying, what a win. You got your shot in at Aaron Murray, and people seem to be on your side about that. You laid low. Otherwise, you just got through it. You're good. You came off confident. You didn't seem squeamish or like you were turning away from anything. And hey, here we are, made it out on the other side. And I think overall it was a win, as much as you can consider a media session a win. I think it was good.
Get Charlie Burris on the line from Orange and White Report. We encourage you to check out his work right there with the rest of his staff as they cover Tennessee football, coming off, as we know, 5-7, 0-8 in the SEC for the first time ever. But new man is in town, and there may be 2 coaches that we could select that are further on the ends of the spectrum, but we might be scratching our head here, Charlie, for a couple hours trying to find those 2 individuals when you talk Butch Jones and Jeremy Pruitt. You mentioned the selection of the players that showed up. And I always read into that, if I can, certain ways, because you've got your coaches who say, I'm selecting the 2 best players. Here we go. There you go. They're coming with me. Or we know who the 2 best players are, and you're going to be talking to them all season, and maybe one of them's not as much of a leader character guy that I would want him to be, so I'm going to hold him back. Want to hear from the offensive linemen because they don't get enough play. A lot of offensive linemen selected to these things, and rightfully so. They do the dirty work. They don't get talked to near enough or get the credit. A lot of different approaches that come into it. 3 players selected here, not necessarily the best players on the team. Your thoughts about who was chosen by Jeremy Pruitt?
I thought they were really good selections. I mean, he's not going to do something like bring Jarrett Garantano along and, in a sense, give away his hand to that quarterback battle. He came out and said that the quarterback battle is going to be between all 4 guys. Let's just put that aside. It's not going to be between 4 guys. It's going to be between Jarrett Garantano and Keller Chris. But anywho, that's beside the point. He's not going to do something like that. And I thought his selections were really good. All three of these guys are guys who have met with media before and are good with media. They are savvy in front of reporters as much as you can be as a player. And just in general, I mean, Marquez Callaway is arguably, there are guys that'll probably give him a run for his money. He's your top player on offense outside of Trey Smith, your top skill player on offense. And Trey Smith, the star offensive lineman, for anyone that doesn't know, he's probably the best offensive lineman in the SEC. But anywho, but Marquez Callaway, I mean, he's your top guy on the offense. He's good in front of media. I think it's a natural choice. Kyle Phillips, also great in front of the press and has been in the past. He's a team leader. He's a senior, been there for a long, long time. Finally getting his shot as probably the top guy in the defense. Essentially out of that entire group, he's been there the longest, or at least close to the longest out of anybody in that unit. And he just, he's well spoken and composed, and I think he was a good choice there. And Eli Wolf is interesting because he was a walk-on at Tennessee. He's a tight end, and he was a walk-on. His brother was a scholarship player, Ethan Wolf, who has since gone on, and he's kind of getting his shot in the NFL. But he walked on so he could play with his brother, and then earned a scholarship, and has kind of gotten this reputation in the team as a guy who's just like nose to the grindstone, absolutely just blue collar, putting in the work. He earns every single thing that he gets. And Pruitt said today that when Pruitt showed up, he said I forget exactly how he put it, but he said like he couldn't block me out there. When Pruitt showed up, and now he gained a bunch of weight. He apparently was named the most improved player on the offensive side of the football during the spring. And so he's kind of just gotten this reputation, I think, with the coaches as this guy who's serious about his business, and he wants to be the best player that he can be. And on top of that, he speaks well and can stay composed in front of media. And so I think they were all good choices, and kind of like Jeremy Pruitt, they all just sort of laid low. There was not a whole lot to talk about with them, and ultimately, I think that's a good thing.
So Kyle Phillips totaled 33 tackles, 4.5 tackles for loss, and a couple sacks last season. Mm-hmm. I got to mention that I had Mike Laval from Last Word on College Football on just a little bit ago. We weren't really talking too much Tennessee, but he mentioned Eli Wolf, and I had to do a double take mentally. Because I was thinking, do you mean Ethan Wolf? Didn't he move on? I didn't question it, but here I see it. Wasn't aware of Eli Wolf. I missed his 3 pass receptions last year, so pardon me, college football fans.
Yeah,
which is for him. His brother had 24 as he moves on to the NFL, and Marquez Callaway, probably the most known of the 3. I don't think there's any question about that. 24 receptions, 5 touchdowns last year for the Vols. So we're going to camp here in about 2 weeks. And this is where Jeremy Pruitt should shine. This is when he really can evaluate talent and coach them up. This is why he was brought in. And any particular guys that, that you're excited to hear positive things about come camp and in your dealings and the glimpses that you get to see on the practice field?
God, it's genuinely almost at every single position on the football field, almost specifically because there were 12 guys out with varying degrees of injury during the spring. I believe every single one will be back during the fall. I don't write a headline on that from me if that's wrong, but I think all 12 guys are back, and then they have 15 newcomers to the team that weren't there during spring ball. And so, I mean, it's going to be a whole new look team. And a lot of those guys like running back Madre London from Michigan State, is a presumed starter number 2 guy. I mean, everyone is sort of assuming he's going to be right up there in the lineup. Obviously, I already mentioned Keller Crisp from Stanford, quarterback, who people are assuming will directly butt heads with Jerry Garantano for the starting job at quarterback. One of those guys. I mean, that's probably the most compelling storyline out of camp. Brandon Kennedy on the offensive line that I already brought up, the transfer from Bama. You got guys transfers from other junior colleges like Dominic Wood Anderson, who's a tight end, and he's supposed to be, just awesome. And so like there's just all over the field, man. There's guys that are coming in that I really want to see, but just mostly there was UT refreshed their rosters this week online, and there were all of these differences in the numbers for guys in terms of their weight and things like that. And these dudes, if the weights are to be believed, there's a ton of guys on this team that have bulked up that are apparently much bigger now after going through a full weight regimen with Craig Fitzgerald, who was the strength coach for the Texans and now is a strength coach at Tennessee. Apparently he's been working wonders with these guys. I want to see that. The list is essentially endless, and really overall just the cohesiveness of the team, because there was so much strife last season within this team. Just like obviously the clashes with the coaches, because the coaches, it was a circus. But outside of that, you had like the quarterbacks like Jared Garantano and Quentin Dormady didn't speak to each other. Obviously, Quentin Dormady now gone. He's at Houston. And so how's the cohesiveness there, specifically between Garantano and Keller Chris? Keller Chris, this newcomer, this sort of alien that's coming in and maybe taking your job. What is that dynamic going to be like? And just it's a totally new look team with a whole different staff. And it looked like they got along during the spring, but they've had more time together now. And just obviously the season's right around the corner. And so what are they going to be looking like on that front? And million different other ways. It's gonna be a good, probably the fall practice that I've covered where there's actually the most to take away from it that I've ever had. I guess this will be my 4th or 5th that I've covered in my short career in media so far. And I think usually it's sort of a all right, let's get through this and get to the season sort of thing. I'm ready to really kind of get out there with a notepad and see what's going on with this team, because there's a lot to be learned with how fresh this team's going to look.
Yeah, for a guy like you who's as familiar with the roster as just about anybody, being familiar with the roster in terms of names and, oh yeah, they were a 4-star from such and such, versus really, getting out there and getting comfortable with what kind of player this person is and what kind of player they could be, and if they're ready to go now or they need to be redshirted and all that. Yeah, I would think that this is the biggest mystery of a Tennessee team that we've seen in quite some time. Far be it for us, Charlie, to be competing with the ESPYs right now. We've been reminded of that here in the chat, so that has hurt us quite a bit, although somebody has let me know that I deserve the ESPY for the best and most dedicated college football analyst. That's nice to know. But otherwise, even Alabama fans giving some sympathy here would like to see Tennessee get better so that the rivalry can be restored to a certain extent.
That whole dynamic there is really interesting to me. So actually, one of the new writers on the beat at Tennessee is David Ubben, who's like a veteran guy. He works for The Athletic now, but he's going to be a beat writer for Tennessee. He's worked at like ESPN, and I think before he was at Fox Sports, maybe. He's been around the block, point being. Great, incredible writer. And he spent the entirety of the last week or the week before in Rainsville, Alabama, which is the hometown of Jeremy Pruitt. And he interviewed everybody in that town. Just, what do you think that, this is the son that got out and truly made something of himself, but he made something of himself at Tennessee. Like, how do you feel about that? And it's really interesting. You can also look at, like, there were former players who played for Alabama that when Jeremy Pruitt was hired, they said things like, oh man, this is extremely conflicting because I love Pruitt. He was my favorite coach, and now he's at Tennessee. What am I supposed to do? I can't root for Tennessee. And so on top of, I agree with that Alabama fan. I think the SEC and college football in general is better when the Tennessee-Alabama rivalry is heated, because they're just two of the most blue blood programs to ever be involved in the sport. But Yeah, that entire dynamic with Alabama fans with Jeremy Pruitt, because he really was. He was beloved there, and obviously very much so in his own hometown. I think at the end of the day, they're all still Alabama fans, but maybe they have a little bit, as much as you can, a soft spot for at least Jeremy Pruitt, maybe not for Tennessee as a whole.
All right, we really enjoyed the conversation. Charlie Burris on the line, Orange and White Report. If you love college football, and I leave out just Tennessee fans because, Charlie, you can imagine the nuts that are watching me on a daily basis. So they love college football across the board. So they can't get enough of the big programs, kind of like me. I'm a nerd. So even if you don't like Tennessee, if you love the SEC and want to keep track of a program that is going to be mighty intriguing, not necessarily this year in terms of wins and losses. Intriguing if you really grind down the development of the players, but if you're looking for wins and losses, maybe not so much this year, except to possibly eke into postseason play. But in the next couple of years, this is going to be the program, one of those in the league, along with a Texas A&M, let's say, where you're like, okay, and Florida. I would put those three in a group to say I'm most intrigued with Tennessee, Florida, and Texas A&M for the next 2 to 3 years based on the name brand, the coach in play, a new coach in play, Jeremy Pruitt, obviously, without a track record, Jimbo Fisher on the other end of the scale with the national championship, Dan Mullen doing what he did at Mississippi State and saying, okay, there are resources here, there are facilities, there's recruiting base that can be taken advantage of to win big, and the name brand is there. Let's see what happens in the next 2 or 3 years for those three programs in particular.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think Florida is maybe outside of Tennessee itself. I think they're the most intriguing team out there. Obviously, maybe not for a fan of Oregon or something like that, but because they're actually in a very, very similar position to Tennessee, and honestly, their roster, they may have a little more depth than Tennessee. But other than that, I mean, they're similarly talented. They're also having a quarterback battle with some guys that were really abysmal last year, a lot like Tennessee, and for some reason they're getting a whole lot of hype. And obviously, I mean, this is going to sound biased, but I swear, I don't get it. I don't see it at the moment. I mean, and I try to do my job well and look at all these other teams that Tennessee's going to play, and I don't see where all the hype is coming in. They absolutely have the talent. Is it a lot better than Tennessee? Like I saw Greg McElroy maybe yesterday, and he said, Tennessee is playing Florida in Neyland Stadium. I mean, it's a home game. It's going to be crazy. The first Florida game with Jeremy Pruitt as coach. And I saw McElroy. He was like, I think Florida goes in and destroys Tennessee, or says beats them convincingly or something. And I was like, what about Florida says that is going to be the case? Maybe I'm insane. Maybe I'm not doing my homework. I mean, I've looked
I'm on your side on this one. I think that's a lean toward Florida, but it being on the road, it's basically a toss up. Yeah, if somebody held a gun to my head to say predict that game right now, I go Gators, more experienced head coach, of course.
I would too, I think, but
in Tennessee was, people have to put into consideration what happened to Tennessee and how they came unraveled. And you cannot look at the record and say that's an 0-8 conference team. That's not an 0-8 roster. You can put a blanket over even Missouri. I'm going to throw Missouri in there. If you went roster from 1 to 75, Tennessee's actually better than Missouri. Now, Missouri's better where it counts, where it's probably going to be more stabilized with star players. And of course, they got arguably the best quarterback in the conference. So they've got, I'm not going to say significant edge, a decided edge, but 1 through 75, I still say Tennessee's roster is better than Missouri's.
Yeah, I've said that this whole offseason. If Jeremy Pruitt does his job really well, and his staff too, and this staff, I think he said it today, the staff has 13 different guys on it that have been on national championship winning staffs. Like, they're accomplished guys. If they do their job at the highest level possible, this roster, at least in the starting 22, has some dudes, has some real dudes. The starting defensive line will have 3 former 5-stars on it. And like, people don't talk about that. Like, it's not like this team is just devoid of talent like some people want you to believe. It was completely and wholly mismanaged in a way that I haven't seen almost at all in college football. I mean, it was incompetence on an unbelievable level with Butch Jones. And so if Jeremy Pruitt can put some real work into these dudes and get them playing with an edge, they got a lot of talent, and they got, physical forms with some of these guys that could be elite athletes. It's getting that elite athlete out of them that's going to be the real task, and getting the culture, the just loser culture that was put into them with Butch Jones, getting that out of them. I mean, that's going to be so tough with some of these guys. But yeah, I mean, that just hasn't gotten talked about with Tennessee. I think some people touch on it, but there really are some pieces on this team. But ultimately, there are a lot of gaps where, and the depth, I think, is the biggest thing. You get past that starting set of players, and it falls off pretty quickly. And so I think ultimately that leads to 5-6 win season this year is what it is. But in time, with good development, ideally, Pruitt can make something happen. We'll see.
I fall into the same trap when making prognostications every year, and that's putting too much on what happened last year. So for a team like South Carolina, we can put a blanket over the entire division except for Vandy at the bottom and Georgia at the top. And South Carolina, yes, they were the second best team, and it wasn't even close. They were decided second best team last year, but just based on winning a bunch of games by 6 or 7 points doesn't necessarily mean that's going to continue this year. It looks like they probably will maintain that and be the second best team, but that's not any kind of guarantee like most of us have predicted.
Absolutely. I don't want to say it's going to be toss up. The SEC, I think this year it's a race for really third place. I mean, it's Alabama, and then it's Georgia, and then it's kind of everybody else. But there's a ton of intrigue. I've said it. I think any of these teams that are in a big rebuild, and I think it's true of Tennessee and specifically Florida, because they're just in both such similar situations. I think they're 5 to 7 win teams, but specifically for Florida, because their schedule is so much easier than Tennessee's. They just scheduled a lot better, and we're given a much easier slate. I mean, I think Florida could be a 10-win team this season. And as much as I hemmed and hawed earlier about how I don't get why people have these big expectations about them, I think Tennessee, when you talk about their ending record, their schedule is just it's probably the hardest in America. I mean, the stretch that they have, 5 games, it's, I believe, Florida, Georgia, Auburn, Alabama, South Carolina, all in a row, which likely will all be ranked teams except for maybe Florida. When Tennessee
plays, I go
ball.
to the mat against the SEC and the rest of the conferences because they don't know how to schedule. So, regardless of what Tennessee did last year, they were 0-8. I don't care if they were 8-0. The schedule should be equitable. So you play everybody in your division. You got to play 2 teams in the other division. Match them up against 2 teams with a composite as close as can be accomplished, composite 500 conference record. Don't match them up against the 2 best teams in the division from last year, and most certainly going to be the 2 best in the division this year. And I know you can't get around the Alabama factor, but then you automatically schedule them against Arkansas and you go from there. That's what I would do. We've got some chat on the line here, and Uncle Lou is chiming in with Will Muschamp always beating Tennessee. Tennessee has never beaten Will Muschamp, even when Muschamp only won 4 games at Florida. So whatever your response is to that.
If I knew why that happened, I would think I would be the coach of Tennessee football. Because the most insane thing about that is that, and I don't think people realize this, Butch Jones beat Steve Spurrier on 3 different occasions. He never lost to Steve Spurrier, not once. That's like, to me, that's the biggest accomplishment of his entire time at Tennessee. You beat Florida, you ended the Florida streak. Congratulations. You beat Steve Spurrier 3 times. That's the most insane thing I've ever heard of. And then he can't beat Muschamp, who's arguably, mediocre at best when you look at his full body of work. He just, like, Tennessee should have won last year. Tennessee had a chance on the goal line to beat South Carolina, and Jarrett Garantano, hit a guy in the hands in the end zone, and the dude just didn't catch it. And, Tennessee was that close to beating them last year. Muschamp is not some world beater. I have no idea. But like I said earlier, Butch Jones is the most incompetent coach that I've ever seen up close. It was unbelievable. The absolute malpractice that he carried out at Tennessee. But
Tennessee was likely the best team on the field 2 straight years, and they found a way to lose to the likes of Arkansas and, of course, the infamous Florida play on the Antonio Callaway 4th and 16, and even the Alabama game. To play that Alabama team in Tuscaloosa and have a lead with 4 minutes left to play, you are doing something.
They had a lead with 2.5 minutes to play in that game, and then ultimately the defense blew it. There was so much. The 2015 and 2016 teams should have had a shot at the playoff with a half decent coach. Your backfield for that team was Josh Dobbs, who's in the NFL. He's back up to Ben Roethlisberger. Alvin Kamara was your running back, who is the offensive rookie of the year in the NFL last year, and Jalen Hurd, who's being touted as this like team saver for Baylor. It's absolutely unbelievable how and Butch took that team and lost to Vanderbilt. Explain that to me. Lost to Vanderbilt, lost to Will Muschamp. We've tried to forget it as far as, giving analysis of Tennessee here locally. But I go back to it every now and again, and it's one of the most baffling things I've ever seen, without a doubt. It's so insane.
All right, Uncle Lou, bringing up the scheduling. Yes, I would schedule during the off season. The professional sports landscape is so much more complicated than scheduling 8 SEC games, and they can pull it off. Major League Baseball can build a schedule between at the end of the regular season and the beginning of spring training, and they can do it with all that myriad of 162 games times 30. Yes, college football can build a schedule during the off season that is fair and equitable. I would tout that, and it would actually give more attention to college football, because on May 1st, we'd have a big schedule release, and everybody would get excited for, let's see what the schedule is. Not, we know what the schedule. Oh, yeah, that's right. We play Notre Dame in 2028.
Absolutely. Even just with Tennessee's scheduling, if all they would do is change the ordering, because there's this tradition with Tennessee that they play Kentucky and Vanderbilt at the very end. That's always the last 2 games. It always has been for as long as I've been around Tennessee football, and I've born and raised in Tennessee, so I've been around my entire life. It's always just been that way. And then they always play Florida 2nd to 4th game every single year. That's always the case. And if you would just move Florida to the end of the season, maybe move Vanderbilt to the beginning of the season, put Kentucky in the middle, spread it out where you're not, like I said, where you're not playing this unbelievable murderer's row where you're just destroying your guys' bodies, where it is, I believe, Florida, Georgia, Auburn, Alabama, and South Carolina all in a row. Like, don't do that. Why would you do that? Yeah, it's not advantageous. I look back at the 2001 season. One of the greatest wins ever over Florida for Tennessee was in 2001. That game fell on the weekend of September 11th in 2001 that year, and it got canceled and it got moved to the end of the year. And I think if that game gets played at the beginning of the season, Tennessee doesn't win, but they did, and they played in the SEC championship game that year because they went into the Swamp and beat Florida. And I think almost without a doubt, it's because they played them at the end of the season, and it got Tennessee to 1 game away from the national championship game that year. And that could be such a game changer. And they just always perpetually, for whatever reason, they have to keep it in this this dumb order where it's extremely light on the back end and super tough right in the middle. I don't get it, but whatever.
Well, Kentucky and Vanderbilt are traditional matchups as well, right? And they have to be on the back end for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean that is, I guess you would consider them rivals. Kentucky's beaten Tennessee twice in the last 32 years, I think. And Vanderbilt, until the last 5 years, a very similar amount, until, Derek Dooley and Butch Jones showed up and it became a regular thing to lose to Vanderbilt. But yeah, that's a traditional game, unfortunately.
So I'm just going to cap this part of the conversation off, and then we actually need to move on by pointing out that there was a year in the SEC, and this was about the time in which LSU could challenge Alabama in the West. It was about 6 years ago when they were coming off their championship run, where because of the scheduling rotation and the locked-in opponents, LSU played two opponents. They were Georgia and Florida at the time, who were both 7-1 the season before. So LSU played two opponents that went 14-2 in the division in the conference the season before. Alabama played two opponents in Kentucky and Vanderbilt that went 2-14. So you have two teams competing for a division championship that play exactly the same 5 games, of course, play each other. Then the 2 games that separate their schedule to determine most likely who's going to go to the SEC championship game come against 14-2 opponents, 2-14 opponents. Now, how that's equitable and fair, I have no idea. That can be adjusted.
I don't get that, and I don't get why there is, at this point, an East and a West, at least when it comes to the SEC championship game. Maybe I get it when it comes to scheduling like that, although if you did away with it, in a lot of places you would lose matchups that you've had for a really long time, like potentially a Tennessee and Kentucky, something like that. But ultimately, is everyone really going to be hurting over that? But anywho, at least I don't get it at the very least when it comes to picking the teams that are in the SEC championship game, because you get matchups like not this past year, but the year before, where it was Florida versus Alabama, and Florida, in 2016, Florida backed in because Tennessee blew it. Because Butch Jones couldn't get his crap together. He beats Florida and Georgia, and then he's an idiot and blows it. And so Florida just gets, run off the field. And I mean, I think that's kind of foolish. I don't really understand that. And I think it's something that could change, sort of to your point of the scheduling.
So that basically happened 4 consecutive years. If you take the Florida championships and the 2 Missouri championships, they could not compete with the SEC Western Division winner.
No, not even close. And, well, I guess Missouri one of those years against Auburn, at least.
They gave Auburn a pretty good run.
Yeah,
they lost
kept decent pace.
They put up some points.
Yeah. Tennessee's scheduling it always sounds like such an excuse. Everyone who's outside looking in always says, well, just get better. Well, yeah, you would if you could, but at the same time, if the schedule was easier, Tennessee wouldn't have had 4 straight losing seasons a few years ago, and that just is what it is.
All right, this is good stuff because I'm monitoring the chat. And Charlie, I apologize. We only have a handful of people on here. I did not send out a notification earlier. I was running like crazy today. Did not get the notification. Plus, Tennessee fans haven't really found me. So, Charlie, next time we have you on, I get the notification out there. We get you to hopefully get that out on social media. We get a big throng here of Tennessee fans. And, of course, there come with that the SEC opponents that love to jump in, and that makes it fun as well to do some trash talking as well. And we're making Uncle Lou and some other people upset.
I'm sure. Let me
excuses for Tennessee.
Yeah. Let me just guess. It's about what I was saying with the scheduling. Well, yeah. Congratulations, you play in the freaking Big Ten or something, I bet, and you get to play Indiana every year. Good for you. And so that's. It's easy for you to say that when you don't have to play Georgia, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina all in a row. Like, that's, I get it. Tennessee should just get better. they were really good. They used to be an absolute powerhouse. Those were the days Tennessee could beat all those teams. It didn't matter if they played all those teams in a row. But when you're having to rebuild your program from where it's at, it is advantageous to schedule, if not easier teams, in a different way, in a different order, at the very least. And don't schedule games like Oklahoma. I like this West Virginia matchup. West Virginia, when this game was scheduled, was kind of just a middling team. And, you didn't know that they were going to have this guy with all this Heisman hype at the time that it was scheduled. I don't mind that game that much, but they were trying to schedule another home and home with Oklahoma in a couple of years. And I was like, why would you do that? Why would you put yourself in that position? You got to play Alabama every year. Why would you schedule another powerhouse out of conference to just put yourself through hell because you're a masochist? Like, why would you do that? Yeah, but at the end of the line, yeah, Tennessee should just get better, but it's much, much easier said than done when you're surrounded by Georgia, Clemson, Florida, Alabama on all four sides,
Well, I'm taking a little bit of grief for my scheduling formula, but again, I can maintain I've done it, and I've released the videos, and I've maintained the rivalry. So Tennessee would play Alabama every year. Auburn would play Georgia every year, but the schedules would just be more equitable. And no, you can't predict how good teams are going to be that current season, but the previous season does give strong indication as to how good programs are typically, and you schedule as equitable as possible. So that's my thought, because you're competing for a championship.
Yeah.
You're competing for a championship, and you can say all you want that so-and-so should be good enough, but that doesn't mean you schedule Ohio State to play Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, Wisconsin, everybody good every week. And then you give Indiana all the worst teams, and you do that in every conference just because somebody's supposed to be good and somebody's not supposed to be good. No, they all play in the same conference and are competing for the same championship. So it's their problem that they're no good, and to their credit that they're good. But you don't just say, you got to beat all the really good teams because you're good and you suck, so we're going to give you a crappy schedule. You just make it equitable.
Yeah, just across the board. Make it the same difficulty for everybody, ideally, so that you're, in that ideal, that's impossible. But that, in that ideal situation, you have the true champion in that, because you won't have a situation like you were describing earlier, where Alabama only has to beat Kentucky and LSU has to beat, whoever, Auburn or whoever you said it was. But at the end of the day, really, there is no excuse to be made there. Tennessee just got to get better at the game of football. that just is what it is. At the end of the line,
the schedule is they got to win the games on the schedule. And when they were good, they won the games on the schedule. And the really good teams fight through difficult schedules. But it does make a difference. What is talked about more than anything, Charlie, during the off season? Schedules. People are looking at schedules. They're making predictions based on schedules. They line up, they put full screens on the videos and say, this is who's going to win this game. This is who's, and based on the matchups, they make predictions, and they don't talk a whole lot about personnel. Most of these videos I see, they're running down schedules and making projections. And take LSU and Iowa. I consider them very comparable football teams. LSU's got a brutal schedule. Iowa has an easy schedule. Therefore, a lot of people are projecting Iowa to win like 10 games and LSU to go into the tank, or at least maybe 6-6.
Well, it's why you see a situation like, I'll keep the example with Iowa and actually Tennessee. A few years ago in 2015, I said with a competent coach, Tennessee could have, I guess that was 2014 that Tennessee played Iowa. 2014. But Tennessee went 6-6 in conference, or 6-6 overall that year, and Iowa went, I want to say like 8-4, and so Iowa, technically had this better record. Tennessee beat them by 40 in the bowl game, and so. Was Tennessee's record not as good as Iowa's? Yes. Was Tennessee the better football team? Absolutely. And so that's, create situations like
And
that.
that happened a couple of years later with Northwestern. Same deal.
Same exact deal where Tennessee, almost the same exact score. I mean, 48-3 or something. Because
45-6. I just remember
45-6. But
that comes to mind. I wouldn't lay a bet on that, but
I think that Northwestern team was like 10-2, I think, coming into that game. And they just got whipped.
And they were 10-2 because they played nobody good in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
They didn't play Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Michigan State. Anyway, Charlie, we appreciate you jumping on board. And speaking of West Virginia and your matchup, which I consider to be an under the radar, really good game potentially this season. Yeah. We talk West Virginia football with a Big 12 country coming on here at 9 o'clock. So, Charlie, appreciate the orange and white talk, and Orange and White Reports, your place to be for Tennessee football coverage. Appreciate you coming on board, Charlie.
Absolutely. It was a ton of fun. My apologies to Uncle Lou. I got on there and looked at the chat. He's not too happy with me, but it just it is what it is. I'm sorry, Lou. I didn't mean to offend you. I'm
sure you guys could mix it up and have a good old time.
Sure.
I would play moderator and it would be phenomenal.
I love a good heated talk about college football, but this was a ton of fun. I really appreciate it, Mark. It's always great to come on here with you.
Definitely appreciate it. And again, everybody, I'm shutting this down, coming right back with West Virginia Talk, Big 12 Media Days at 9 o'clock Eastern, which we are a few minutes past, but just hang in for that. We'll see you, Charlie.
All right. Thanks. See you, Mark.
Take care.